4. Hijack. An hour later, when the remains of Franklin Harvey had been taken away, fingerprint experts and police photographers were still at work in the murder room. The boy who had murmured the name, Jonah, was still unconscious in the police nursing home. Zak Biko and Colonel Jack Jones faced the squad of men who had been on duty outside the Harvey residence during the time when the girl Linda Harvey had presumably vanished into thin air. The rain had let up a little and it was now daylight. They had searched the great house from the attics to the gloomy wine cellars, but Linda Harvey was nowhere to be found. The colonel expressed his fear that the girl might have been killed like her late uncle, but Zak did not agree with him. The discarded silk night clothes were against that theory. Why dress up to be murdered? Okay. How did it happen? Zak Biko asked the questions and the men shifted uneasily about. Right around the back there's a wide stretch of mud, Mr. Biko, said one of them. There is only a low stone wall separating these grounds from that near swamp and, what with the rain, there's nothing to show. It wouldn't be difficult for her or them to have escaped unseen that way. The man wiped his face that glistened with sweat despite the cold. I was down there the last 2 hours and I saw nothing. Several others had reports to make but no one could throw the slightest light upon the mystery of Linda Harvey's vanishing trick. Colonel Jones finally sent the men back to their posts with threats to slap a charge on the next man to overlook evidence in connection with the developing mystery. Janet Kendall had collapsed in hysterics and had been given a knockout pill. But her husband Sid was still mooning about the place, getting in everyone's way. The man seemed unable to control himself sufficiently to take to his own bed for an hour or so. Right. Zak passed a hand over his own tired features. Let's rustle up some more of Sid Kendall's coffee, Jack. Then I'd like you to phone through for reports on that ship. Don't ask me to explain. I'm too tired and too worried. I don't think Linda Harvey has had much of a life, but she's in danger of losing it now. Zak went to the hall and yelled for Sid, who came running. Coffee, Sid. Hot and strong. Zak grinned at the older man. Don't panic, man. I'll find your young mistress. Sid didn't wait to argue. He almost ran in the direction of the kitchen. Zak went back to his chief. Colonel Jack Jones was on the telephone already. He was listening intently to whatever the person on the other end had to say. Is that so? He spoke angrily. Look, you keep Captain has hid bloody Ahmed behind locks and bolts until I say differently, see? I'll have the Queen of Bermuda impounded at the docks for as long as necessary. He'll come clean or he'll find himself with free board and lodgings permanently. Tell him I said so. Colonel Jones banged down the handset. That Turk captain. How do you like this? He's demanding diplomatic immunity, wants the best lawyer, etc., etc. To say nothing of complaining about the food he's getting for nothing, let him rot. Zak Biko was wearing his jacket again but looked anything but his usual smart self. I've sent Sid Kendall for fresh coffee, then I'll be off. This gang will be broken and the leader dead, or in jail, before this week is out. That's a promise, Jack. I believe it's the work of the so-called Black Gang. Jack Jones sat down heavily. Don't make idle promises, young man. The leader could be this Franklin Harvey. That money and the dope in his study all point to it. No. Zak's tone was decisive. Look, Harvey was a millionaire, many times over, maybe. He owned a massive chain of stores all over the land. Isn't that a perfect way of distributing dope? Along with the groceries. But he wasn't, the leader. Zak came and leaned closer. All we know about this so-called Black Gang, they're mostly white men incidentally, is that it has been successfully operating internationally for the past 5 years. Jones growled his agreement. But somewhere in the background there has to be a setup. It has to be headed by a man of wealth, a man who is able to move in society without suspicion. As I said, the Black Gang works on land, on sea, and in the air. this we know. Their organization is so big that it won't fall apart until I get the leader. It has to be broken from the top. Jones sighed. Tell me something I don't know already, son. I'm doing just that, Jack. I'm doing just that. Will you set inquiries going through the French Secret Service? About Jonah and Hannah Harvey? That train smash took place 19 years ago, they must have records. Sure, they will. But what's to stop this Jonah from changing identity along the line? If it was a good crash there wouldn't have been any shortage of dead and mutilated bodies. This Jonah Harvey could have changed his identity with some ease. Certainly he could have done. I believe Hannah was killed, but I'm not so sure about Jonah. Zak pulled the half sheet of pale yellow vellum paper from his shirt pocket and showed it to the colonel. See that? I never was keen on coincidence. Jack Jones brightened. Took you long enough to come up with this. I'll remind you that you're under my orders, Biko. I'll write my resignation, grinned Zak. The police in London have offered me twice what you pay me. He made for the door, only to be recalled by an angry roar from the colonel. Jonah! It can't be true. He died. Colonel Jack Jones read the cryptic message aloud, then stared up into Zak's face. So that's it. Without waiting for an answer he reached for the telephone, barked a number into it and then waited impatiently for it to ring back. Zak Biko stood back, waiting for his colonel to give his instructions, knowing that the French inquiries would be underway within minutes. Sid Kendall came in with the same heavy silver coffee tray and the same delicate china. He laid the tray on the table and looked anxiously from man to man. Any news? Zak shook his head. Look at this, Sid. He held out the yellow writing paper. The man stared down at it, making no attempt to touch it. Read it, man. Sid read the few words, then he backed away like a man scared for his own skin. Where'd you find that, mister? Zak Biko reached out a long arm and held him fast. Talk, damn you. Who is Jonah, and where is he? He shook the older man like he would shake a puppy. He came here, didn't he? Maybe to demand some money from his brother. Is that it? And you saw him and recognized Jonah Harvey in spite of the 19 years since you last met. Zak continued to shake Kendall, but no sound came from the man's loose mouth. There was no doubt that he was badly frightened. Behind them Colonel Jones murmured, "Go easy, Zak," but he might as well have kept silent for all the notice Zak took of him. If anything, the special agent began to get tougher. On the table the coffee was neglected and forgotten. Zak grabbed Kendall by the shirt collar. Talk, damn you. Why else did your Miss Linda faint when I asked her who Jonah was? Sid's face was chalk white but the skin at his throat tightened. Zak brought his own face to within half an inch of that of the frightened houseman. You'll answer me, or I'll take you into town, and if you think you'll hold out there you're badly mistaken. Linda Harvey is missing. I want her found. Talk. Raising a shaking hand, Sid managed to indicate that he'd had enough rough stuff. Zak Biko half released him. Miss Linda's been getting away into New York City some nights. Sid was having trouble with his tonsils. He tottered towards a chair and sat down heavily at a push from Zak. Okay, Sid. Take your time. Leave nothing out, see? Or you and I'll be taking a little ride together. Sid coughed. I don't know much. There's a man. Tom Larning's his name. Miss Linda says he's in advertising. I wouldn't know. Can you give us a description of this man? It was Colonel Jones asking the question. Sid nodded reluctantly. Sure, I can. And much good may it do you. Larning's educated, about 6 feet in height, dark hair, regular features. He's around 28, I'd say, but I can't be certain about that. Miss Linda met him when she went shopping about 3 weeks back. That's what she told me in Jan, anyway. Sid's tonsils had loosened up a little. Look, Me and Jan's very fond of the girl. Jan's been like a mother to her all these years. It was wicked the way the master kept her chained up here. He never minded giving her money, as much as she wanted, and she could go shopping, but that's all. The words were tumbling out now, but Zak stopped him. Okay, so she goes shopping in New York and meets up with this guy Larning. What happened then? Sid swallowed loudly. Well, it was like this. Me and Jan got to helping the girl to slip away nights. Always after dinner when Mr. Franklin went into his study. He never allowed us near that room, not after dark. Miss Linda knew she was safe once he told her to go and enjoy her own sitting room. That's the way he always put it, see? So, Linda scuttled out the staff entrance to meet this Larning. How? Zak's bark startled the man. She never slept with him if that's what you're asking, mister. If she did, that's her own problem. Zak stared down into Sid's eyes. Get on with it. Is that where she been tonight? Or rather last night? Sid nodded. That's about right, mister. She left around 9 o'clock. They had dinner together as usual, but Mr. Franklin wasn't wanting to prolong the dinner. He told her to have an early night as he had business to see to. I heard him say it. The colonel spoke. Did this Larning drive down to fetch the girl? Sid nodded. He used to come in the back drive gate. He'd leave his car about half a mile away and then walk. So far as I know, that's what happened last night. She came in just before me and the missus arrived back. Mr. Franklin always insisted that we used the front entrance on our nights out. Zak grinned viciously. There's something else out of place, isn't there, Sid Kendall? Sid started out of his chair. I've told you all I know, mister. Zak shook his head. Not all, Sid. You won't forget what I warned you, will you? I can't think no more, Sid whined. I'll help you out. Linda Harvey has rooms on the other side of this house. Her escapades with this Larning had to be kept secret from her generous uncle, right? Sid nodded his agreement. Then what was she doing wandering about on this side of the house last night, in the dark and at midnight? Zak had not raised his voice, but it was full of hidden menace. The man flinched. I wasn't here. I don't know what she was up to. Normally Miss Linda would have been scared silly to do such a thing. A female voice, dripping acid, replied from the doorway. Leave him be, Biko. He's told you all we know. Let him come up to bed. It was Janet Kendall. Her arms were folded across her broad breasts, her face was purple with anger. Sid struggled to his feet only to be pushed back again by his relentless questioner. You forgot something, Sid. Zak was politely firm. Maybe now Janet has joined us she could help jog your memory. Ask your question and leave my Sid alone. We've always done what we could for Miss Linda and nothing wrong neither. What's on your mind now? Zak turned to smile at her. Only Jonah, Janet. Simple, isn't it? I only want to know why Linda Harvey fell into such a bad faint when I asked her that same question. Who is Jonah? You'll either tell me, one of you, or Sid goes down to our headquarters. He delivered this ultimatum with bland courtesy. There was a long silence which Sid broke with a regretful sigh. He came to see us when the master was away in Frisco some months ago. He told me and Jan here that he was Mr. Jonah and that he hadn't been killed in that crash. Only Mrs. Hannah, that was Miss Linda's mother. Janet took up the tale. He shocked the daylights out of both of us. He seemed to know the master was away. He looked very like what we remembered of him, only he was 20 years older, of course. Of course. Zak murmured the words. He wanted to see Miss Linda, you see, but was scared stiff of meeting his brother after all those years. Anyway, we smuggled Mr. Jonah upstairs into Miss Linda's rooms. He stayed there until they came home again. Mr. Franklin always took the girl with him on long trips, you see. Janet brushed her graying hair out of her eyes. That's the truth. What went on between them two we don't know, except that they got on well and Miss Linda seemed happier afterwards. Did they meet again? And, if so, how, and where? Zak rounded the table to stand before Janet. You must know, Janet. Janet did not hesitate this time. Yes. So far as I know they met a few times in New York. That was when she went out to spend the evening with Tom Larning. Zak nodded, satisfied. One more thing and then you can both go to your quarters. You will not, however, leave these premises. Not without my written permission, anyway. The Kendalls nodded. I want Larning's address. And don't kid me you don't know it. I can't see you allowing your precious Linda out without knowing where her escort lived. Janet was obviously reluctant to give this information, but she knew when she was beaten. Tom Larning has an apartment in the National Bank buildings on 9th Avenue, off Broadway. Me and Sid took a cab ride just to make sure about that. He lives there all right. And now we'd like to get to bed. I don't want a sick husband to nurse on top of all this. Janet sounded indignant and very, very tired. When the Kendalls had departed, Zak dropped his guard and looked like the worried man he was. Her life's not safe, Jack. I'll leave you to take charge of the dope and the money. I've got things to do. He made for the door. I'll be in touch. He left while Colonel Jack Jones was still swearing at him in 3 different languages. The great white car gleamed in the watery sunshine, the rain had stopped, and the clouds had disappeared for the time being. Zak Biko slid in under the driving wheel. The engine fired at once and soon he had the car out in the traffic that was streaming towards the city. He couldn't tell when it was that he realized he wasn't alone in the car, but it was not long before he felt the cold ring of a gun barrel bite the back of his neck. The voice that spoke was husky, even nervous. Zak Biko was a difficult man to meddle with, every crook in several countries knew that by now. Don't try nothing or you won't live to tell your tale, Biko. Zak kept his eyes on the road ahead. The cars beside him moved swiftly along, their occupants intent on their own business. He wondered if other drivers or their passengers could see the weapon against his neck. The attacker seemed to read his thoughts. Like I say, Biko. Don't act stupid. The gun is small but very lethal. It don't show up because it's hidden by a handkerchief and because of the casual way I'm leaning over your seat, see? What do you want with me? The man laughed coarsely. I don't want no part of you, wise guy. I'm acting for someone who thinks you might make a nuisance of yourself soon. Like getting too close to what shouldn't concern you. Keep on to Lexington Drive and then turn left for 2 blocks. And if I don't do as you say? Then you'll be taking a turn towards the graveyard, copper. The man giggled unpleasantly, and Zak's fingers tightened on the wheel. Who do you work for, you lousy? Zak forced a laugh into his voice and the gunman reacted as Zak expected. Careful. I'll bust your skull in unless you're very careful. Go right ahead. Zak laughed outright and increased his speed a little. This is a mighty powerful machine, brother. I wouldn't be the only one who got busted up. At that moment, the traffic got snarled up and the great Mercedes slid effortlessly to a halt behind an open van with 2 men smoking in the back, guarding some parcels. Zak glanced idly into his driving mirror and decided the time had come to try dislodging the gunman who was tickling the back of his neck with a .38 pistol. Hold it, Zak warned. I've got a sneeze coming on. He slid his left hand down over his pocket, feeling the comforting bulge of his own revolver. Move another inch and it'll be your last. His assailant sounded nervous. With the speed of a karate expert, Zak moved his whole body to the right, at the same time bringing his left arm upwards, so fast that it was doubtful if the gunman saw it coming. There was a dull explosion as his hand chopped the gun arm sideways, followed at once by the smack of a bullet penetrating the windscreen. Within seconds the gun had dropped to the floor and Zak's uninvited passenger found himself in the grip of an unbreakable arm lock. The 2 men in the van leapt down, more in fright than from any desire to get involved in 3 gunfights. But the bullet had come whistling close to their perch on top of the parcels and their tempers were up. One of them reached inside Zak's car, grabbing hold of the gun. Zak grinned at them. "Thanks." He held me up, hiding in the back on the floor, I guess. He smashed a fist into the gunman's head. It landed solidly. "You want us to call the cops, mister?" The van men were anxious to be helpful. "No, thanks all the same. For your information, I am the police." His hand indicated the unconscious thug. "This little bird you helped me catch will be useful in many ways. I'm anxious to renew our acquaintance, second chance in the quiz stuff. I have a feeling he's a mine of information about a man I badly want to meet." By now the traffic seemed to be unsnarling itself and the van men said, "So long," and climbed back into the back of the van. Easing the big white car over to the sidewalk, Zak hauled the unconscious man onto the seat beside him and made a swift search through his pockets. What he found before the traffic moved again was a small pill box filled with white powder. So, this guy was a member of the junkie club, a taker of habit-forming dangerous drugs? Zak raised his companion's eyelids and then was sure of it. Dope pushers? Too many escaped the judicial net even when they were caught. But they couldn't escape the nets laid down by Zak Biko, there was no escape. He was a law unto himself when dealing with hardened narcotic salesmen. His questing fingers touched something hard in the man's top pocket. He pulled out a plain gold ring engraved with initials. Bleakly he glanced at the letters, LHH, standing for Linda Hannah Harvey. He'd seen the ring on the girl's finger only hours back. Savagely, Zak restarted the car. He wondered if it was worth taking this mug to the headquarters of his special branch but decided in favor of his own private apartment.